Let's expand on that headline story, because the country can expect a hotter summer than usual, while some parts will see below normal rainfall, and that is due to the El Niño weather phenomenon currently being experienced in the Republic. We're now joined by Professor Midgley, Acting Director for Climate Studies at Stellenbosch University. Prof, thank you for your time this afternoon. Let's start with a basic understanding of what we are talking about when we speak of El Niño.
Thanks for having me. El Niño is a state of the global climate which involves a reorganization of the energy in the oceans in the Pacific. And essentially what happens is that more warm water piles up against the eastern side of the Pacific because of a change in wind patterns along the equator. And that appears to have effects right across the globe, or is part of a syndrome which causes these effects right across the globe, including generally warmer conditions for the planet as a whole.
Mm-hmm. And so when we speak of warmer conditions, are we expecting this for larger parts of the country? Are we looking at specific parts of the country?
It's very hard to predict it. I hate to have to hedge like that. But every El Niño event is different, and the way that it plays out in southern Africa is different. So in 98, we were expecting a very significant El Niño, which did happen, but it didn't have the effect that was predicted. And ever since then, I think African meteorologists have been very gun-shy about making very serious predictions, because we now know that there are other things that affect the rainfall pattern, including what happens in the Indian Ocean. There's a similar pattern to the El Niño in the Indian Ocean called the Indian Ocean Dipole, arrangement of energy in the Indian Ocean between Australia and southern Africa. And it's the interaction of these two systems that seems to be really important, but we haven't done enough research on that.
Prof, is this arrangement of energy becoming harder to predict?
Well, it's not becoming harder to predict. The models that are used for climate projections by the IPCC don't even get it right historically. So that's led to this big problem in trying to predict what are the impacts of climate change on the Indian monsoon, for example, an incredibly important climate system. And part of the problem is that southern hemisphere science, the science of the atmosphere in the southern hemisphere, is severely underfunded. Africa gets less than 3% of the global funding for climate change research, which is an incredibly appalling figure. Less than 3% for the continent that's going to experience the most impacts and is least responsible. It's shocking.
Who should do what then? We are flying all over the world to attend these summits. We are presenting papers to speak of how this is impacting the continent. But who should do what?
Well, firstly, at these international negotiations, our negotiators need to be negotiating far harder for funding transfers into the science system in Africa. The Thomson Reuters did a poll of the top 1,000 climate scientists a few years back. How many Africans were in that list? Out of 1,000, 4. That is the outcome of this appalling lack of funding into African climate science.
Does that not lead to a distortion, Prof, this lack of funding into climate science on the continent? Because to your point of the representation, which we always say it matters, there was a scientist who did a report about how the reporting or the studies then paint a distorted picture in terms of what happens in the global north and the global south, for lack of a better expression. And so does it not lead to distortions? Should we not be taking things with a pinch of salt until we can determine it ourselves?
Well, I don't think we should take things with a pinch of salt. The climate science is very clear on the warming and the risk of global warming for Africa. There's no question about that. All African scientists agree with that. But the challenge is that we often have to then swallow solutions that are being sent to us from the northern hemisphere of the developed world. And we often get dumped with aging technology and, it's a thing that often happens. So, and the lack of funding just really makes it difficult for us to make our voices heard in a credible way. I mean, we punch well above our weight. I mean, there's no question. But for example, Africa is the only continent without it hasn't developed a climate model for the world. Almost all other continents have a climate. Australia's got its own climate model. I'm not sure South America does. But so we don't have a model that we have developed and are able to run ourselves to simulate the things that really matter to us. All the work done, a lot of the work done on the Indian Ocean dipole, which is very relevant to us, is done in relation to how it affects the climate of Western Europe. So that's an outcome, and the ratios are very, very distorted.
Because also, Prof, does it not influence policy? We are told that we need to move, for instance, to renewables. That's not the debate for today. But if we are the least contributors in terms of carbon emissions, we are least funded in terms of the research to go into climate studies. We are the least contributors. Why then are we importing solutions that are, not based on what the research on this here continent speaks to, because it informs policy?
Well, I don't think we can make that conclusion. The use of fossil fuels and fossil energy is a dinosaur technology which has lots of other adverse impacts on human health, on the environment, on water quality, on people's lives, and in South Africa, on the roads. We're the Saudi Arabia of renewable energy. So that argument is, I think, a false argument. But I would be much more concerned about how we understand climate change adaptation, and also swallowing solutions that are imposed from the north, like planting forests into southern African grasslands and savannas, which are not supposed to have forests in them. So, and we've written a lot about that, and really been influential in trying to shift that funding flow, which is tens to hundreds of millions of dollars in euros, impacting the use of African landscapes. So there's a lot at stake here, and there's no question that we should go to renewables. That's a no-brainer for us. We're missing major opportunities by slowing that down, because there are many, many other benefits. But it's on adaptation and the risks that we are really far behind, because we don't have. We need better science to serve ourselves.
Okay. Well, when we take a look then at when we speak of solutions, because you hear a lot African solutions to African problems, indigenous knowledge systems, what is being done with that space, right? Because there's been solutions that are age-old from this here continent as well. And also, when you bemoan that we are not getting enough funding, what does it speak to? Is it governments on the continent that are not awake to it yet? Where should the money come from?
Well, I'll start with the money. The money should come from the international community, which should be supporting African institutions and African scientists, so that we can keep our best scientists on the continent. At the moment, we train scientists and they leave the African continent because there are many more opportunities and better salaries available for them overseas. So a lot of our best scientists fly the coop for a better lifestyle. And that relates to the way that we are governed here in Africa to a large extent. So, and our institutions don't have the career paths and the sustainable career paths that should be available to us. So we see that here in South Africa at the moment with defunding of a lot of the science. Not necessarily in climate change, but more generally in the higher education system. But otherwise, I'm sorry, could you just repeat your first question?
Sure, no problem. Just asking where the money should come from, and also indigenous knowledge systems. What is being done in that space to harvest that these age-old solutions that we have?
Look, I think indigenous and local knowledge is important. There are parts of South Africa where farmers are able to eke a living from and make actually a good living from under very difficult circumstances, without government funding, as is the case in Europe, for example, where farmers have lots of subsidies. So we're very efficient at generating calories from a very, very poor climate base, and our farmers need to be really acknowledged for that. But the challenge with indigenous knowledge is that as climate changes, the value of indigenous knowledge is lost because that knowledge was developed under a previous climate system. And it's not acknowledged that this cost to Africa is not acknowledged. It can lead to complete changes in lifestyles, in human livelihoods that become unviable. And this is a real challenge. So indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, very, very important. But these aspects do have their limitations, and as climate changes, they become less valuable. And that's very unfair, and it's inequitable. So, and it's underappreciated.
Okay, that's very different to what we've been hearing so far. Defunding of science that you speak of, what does that mean? The Higher Education Minister would disagree.
Well, I'm not saying that defunding, that's too strong a word, but the funding system in South Africa has been going through a fairly long series of cuts. That's impinging on our ability as universities to do the training, to train the kind of students that we need to take on these challenges for the next several decades. And so I think many universities are relying more and more on international funding, and that funding may come with different strings attached. So it's far better for our Treasury to fund science, fund the weather services, because the return on that investment will last for decades to come. And these funding cuts are just counterproductive, and they will leave us in a much more vulnerable position. So I would really call for a reversal of these sorts of funding limitations. We really, really need as a country to grow our institutions to provide the sorts of skills that we're going to need for decades to come. This is a huge job opportunity as well for new kinds of science and new kinds of practitioners that every municipality, every business is going to need experts in climate change adaptation.
Professor Guy Midgley, thank you so much for your time this afternoon, Acting Director for Climate Studies at Stellenbosch University. More news for you in a few moments.